The gold blunder everyone makes. During hyperinflation, a man holds gold in his hands. He thinks he is safe. He thinks he has done everything right. But there's one move he's about to make, one decision, that will cost him everything. And the terrifying part, almost everyone makes it. Every single time. The historians recorded it, the economists studied it, and yet people keep making the same blunder. Will you? Welcome to Dominance Aura, where history's most expensive lessons are studied so you never have to pay for them yourself. Now, before we go any further, this channel asks just one small favor. If you're the kind of person who believes in being prepared, not panicked, hit that subscribe button right now. Think of it this way. Your grandfather didn't ignore a good warning when he heard one. Don't you either. And one more thing, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? London? Karachi? New York? Lagos? Let the community know. It matters more than you think. In 1922, a successful German merchant named Heinrich sat in his study and felt something rare for that era. Calm. All around him, neighbors were panicking. Prices were climbing. The newspapers reported new numbers every morning that made the numbers from the day before look like a joke. Bread, milk, coal. Everything was rising so fast that shopkeepers stopped writing price tags because by the time a customer reached the shelf, the number had already changed. But Heinrich was not worried, because Heinrich had gold. He had spent years accumulating it, quietly, carefully. While others spent their wages on holidays and furniture, he converted his savings into coins. Real coins. Coins that held weight in the hand. Coins that governments could not print more of overnight. He had done what every serious man should do. He had prepared. And so he sat in his study, surrounded by financial chaos, and felt calm. That calm was the blunder, not the gold. The gold was correct. The gold was exactly the right asset. The blunder was something far more invisible and far more dangerous. It was the mental model sitting behind the gold, the assumption about how gold works when paper money is dying in real time. Heinrich, like thousands of men exactly like him across Germany in those years, had prepared the right tool and completely misunderstood how to use it. Here is what the historical record shows. And this is the part that changes everything for anyone building wealth today. Gold does not function the way most people imagine it will during a hyperinflation. It does not sit comfortably in the pocket, walk into a bakery, and exchange cleanly for a loaf of bread. The documented forensic record from Weimar Germany, from diaries, diplomatic dispatches, journalist accounts, and economic reports filed in real time, tells a very different story from the one circulating in most financial communities today. The story of gold in a hyperinflation is not a story of smooth transactions and protected wealth. It is a story of hoarding, confusion, mistimed decisions, and a series of very specific blunders made by otherwise intelligent, otherwise prepared people. Heinrich would eventually spend his gold. He would spend it at exactly the wrong moment, for exactly the wrong price, and he would never fully understand why. That is where this story begins. Here is something the financial world rarely admits. The most dangerous moment in any economic crisis is not when a man has nothing. It is when a man has something and does not understand what he is actually holding. By mid-1923, Heinrich still had his gold. He had protected it through months of chaos. He had watched neighbors lose everything. He had seen grown men beg for bread with fistfuls of paper that, just 2 years earlier, represented comfortable retirements. He had survived all of it. His gold was still in his drawer, but something had shifted inside him. The crisis was not ending. It was accelerating. And Heinrich, like thousands of educated, prepared men across Germany in that exact moment, began to feel a pressure that no financial textbook had ever warned him about. Not government pressure, not legal pressure, psychological pressure. The slow, grinding daily terror of watching everything around him collapse, and wondering if waiting was wisdom, or if waiting was simply another word for losing. That psychological pressure is where the blunder actually lives. The forensic record is specific about what happened next, not just to Heinrich, but to an entire class of gold holders across Weimar Germany. In 1922, a British diplomatic dispatch filed by Lord d'Abernon, the British ambassador in Berlin, recorded something extraordinary. He wrote that he barely knew a single German citizen, man or woman, who was not desperately speculating in foreign currencies, dollars, pounds, Swiss francs, not gold coins, foreign paper. This was not panic from the poor. This was calculated survival behavior from the educated middle class, the very people who had prepared, the very people who held gold. They were converting it, not holding it, converting it, selling gold to acquire dollars because the dollar was doing what gold was supposed to do, functioning as a daily unit of exchange in a collapsing economy. Economist Constantino Bresciani Tironi, who studied the Weimar collapse in forensic detail, documented the pattern precisely. Gold holders who entered the crisis, correctly positioned, made one critical strategic error at the midpoint. They treated their gold as a transaction currency rather than a terminal store of value. They spent it, converted it, or surrendered it, just months before the stabilization that would have returned their purchasing power completely intact. They solved the short-term problem and destroyed the long-term position. Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer who lived through the neighboring Austrian hyperinflation simultaneously, captured the street-level reality and language that no economic report could match. He described watching respectable families, doctors, lawyers, university professors, arriving at rural farmhouses on the outskirts of Vienna. They carried paintings, crystal, silverware, leather-bound books that had taken decades to collect. They set these objects on farmhouse tables and traded them for potatoes and milk. The farmers accepted everything. The paper money they refused entirely. What Zweig was documenting was the complete collapse of the mental model that educated people had built their entire financial lives upon. The model that said, save correctly, trust the institutions, and the system will protect you. That model did not just fail. It inverted. The man who saved in marks was destroyed. The man who borrowed in marks and bought hard assets was enriched. The man who donated his gold to the Iron Campaign in 1914 out of patriotism had nothing left by 1923. The man who quietly kept his gold but converted it too early for dollars came out slightly ahead, but nowhere near whole. The man who held gold through the entire collapse and survived the interim on barter, on speed, on commodity thinking. He came out the other side with his purchasing power completely intact. That is not a motivational story. That is a documented forensic outcome. And it raises a question that every serious businessman, every aspiring entrepreneur, every young professional building wealth today must sit with carefully. Not do you have gold, but do you understand what you're actually holding and what it will demand from you when the moment arrives? Because the record shows clearly, the blunder is never made at the beginning. It is always made in the middle, when the pressure is highest and the end is not yet visible. There's a particular kind of suffering that history reserves for the prepared man who prepared incorrectly. Not the man who ignored the warning signs, not the man who spent everything and saved nothing, not the man who trusted blindly and never questioned. History is relatively merciful in its judgment of those men. They were simply uninformed. The suffering history reserves its sharpest documentation for is the man who saw the crisis coming, who acted, who sacrificed, who made real decisions that cost him real comfort in the present to protect his future, and then made one wrong move at the critical moment. That man does not appear in history as a victim. He appears as a case study, and the Weimar record is full of them. Mistake 1. Spending gold. During the crisis, instead of holding through stabilization. In the summer of 1923, a Berlin physician named Dr. Albrecht made a decision that felt at the time like wisdom. He had held gold through 2 years of accelerating inflation. He had watched the mark collapse from thousands to millions to billions per dollar. He had resisted every impulse to panic. And then, in August 1923, just 91 days before the stabilization, he converted his gold holdings into dollars and used them to secure his family's immediate needs. He was not reckless. He was not foolish. He calculated carefully and acted deliberately. But the stabilization came on November 15th, 1923. The gold he had held for 2 years and surrendered in August would have restored his entire pre-war purchasing power had he held it 11 more weeks. 11 weeks. The forensic record documents this pattern repeatedly across Weimar Germany. Gold holders who survived the psychological pressure of the early and middle crisis, only to liquidate their position in the final, most intense phase, just before stabilization, made holding gold the single most profitable financial decision of the entire era. The lesson for today's businessman is not sentimental. It is structural. An asset held correctly through 90% of a crisis and surrendered in the final 10% does not deliver 90% of its value. It delivers a fraction, because the recovery, the stabilization, is where the entire value of patient holding is realized. Patience is not a virtue in this context. It is a strategy, and strategies require completion. Mistake 2. Failing to establish a parallel currency conversion strategy before collapse. Ernest Hemingway crossed the Rhine from France into Germany in September 1922, carrying 10 French francs and 90 cents in Canadian money. He and his wife spent an entire day, meals, goods, transport, and still had money remaining at the end of it. His German neighbors could not afford 5 apples. The difference between Hemingway and his German neighbors was not intelligence. It was not preparation in the traditional sense. It was one specific strategic element that the German middle class had almost universally failed to establish before the crisis made establishing it nearly impossible. A parallel currency position. The dollar, the pound, the Swiss franc. These did not become useful during the Weimar hyperinflation. They became accessible during it only to those who had acquired them before it reached its terminal phase. By mid-1923, converting marks to dollars required connections, black market access, and a significant loss on exchange. The window for clean, efficient conversion had closed months earlier. The businessman who waits for visible crisis to begin building his parallel currency position has already missed the optimal entry point. Lord Dabernon's 1922 diplomatic dispatch documented that the Germans who navigated the crisis most effectively were not those with the most gold. They were those with the most optionality, multiple currency positions, multiple asset classes, multiple conversion pathways established before a single one of them was urgently needed. Optionality built before crisis, that is the documented survival architecture. Mistake 3, continuing to price assets in the collapsing currency. By late 1923, over 4,000 separate entities across Germany were printing their own emergency currency, not Geld, necessity money. It appeared on paper, ceramic, leather, silk, wood, and compressed coal dust. But the most significant not Geld was not remarkable for its material. It was remarkable for its unit of account. The Oldenburg Rye bond of 1922 did not promise marks. It promised 125 kilograms of rye, redeemable 4 years later at 150 kilograms, a 4.5% yield. In rye, not in marks. In rye. The Krupp Steelworks in Essen paid workers in Krupp marks. An internal currency convertible, not to paper, but to food and essential goods at company stores. It became the most stable currency in the city precisely because it was anchored to something real. The businessmen and industrialists who survived the Weimar hyperinflation with commercial operations intact shared one documented characteristic. They stopped denominating their transactions in marks before the general market forced them to. They repriced contracts in dollars, in commodity units, in kilowatt hours, in bushels of grain. The businessman who continues pricing his assets, his contracts, and his services in a collapsing unit of account is not being conservative. He's being gradually, invisibly, mathematically destroyed. Every day he waits to reprice is a day the currency does the repricing for him, at a rate he does not control and cannot recover from. Mistake 4, moving too slowly. Sebastian Hafner was a boy in Berlin in 1923. He described his father's payday ritual in his memoir with a precision that no economist could replicate. The moment his father received his salary, the family did not rest. They did not plan. They did not deliberate. His mother was already waiting at the factory gate. The money moved immediately. Transit pass, essential goods, dry supplies, converted into anything real before the next price revision hit. Because in Weimar Germany at the height of the crisis, prices were not revised monthly, not weekly, not daily. They were revised by noon. A newspaper that cost 50,000 marks at breakfast cost 100,000 marks by evening. The banknote, still warm from the printer, lost measurable value on the walk from the bank to the grocery store. Friedrich Kroner, a Berlin journalist who documented the crisis in real time, wrote that survival required moving faster than the printing press. Not smarter, faster. The businessman who processes economic signals slowly, who waits for consensus, who requires certainty before acting, who moves at the speed of institutional comfort, is precisely the profile the Weimar record identifies as most destroyed. Stefan Zweig summarized it with a precision that 100 economic reports could not improve upon. Slow thinking and reliance on previous experience were punished with hunger and destruction. Impulsive action and swift comprehension of a new situation were rewarded. Swift comprehension, not the right asset. Not the right currency, not the right connection, the right mental speed. 4 mistakes, 4 documented patterns, 4 specific points at which otherwise prepared, otherwise intelligent, otherwise positioned people surrendered the protection they had spent years building. And here is what makes this forensic record genuinely alarming for the serious businessman sitting with it today. Not one of these 4 mistakes required ignorance to make. Every single one of them was made by informed, educated, prepared people who simply did not think the problem through completely enough. Before the moment arrived that made thinking clearly nearly impossible. There's a moment in every economic crisis that historians can identify precisely in retrospect, but that almost no one can identify while living through it. It is the moment when preparation stops being optional, not the moment the crisis begins, not the moment the headlines confirm what the data had been quietly signaling for months. By the time the crisis was visible to the general public, the window for optimal preparation had already closed. That is not a historical observation, that is a current warning. Consider what the macroeconomic record shows today with the same forensic discipline applied to Weimar Germany. The United States debt-to-GDP ratio stood at 32% during the 1970s. It stands at 121% today. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from $4.2 trillion to $9 trillion between 2020 and 2022 alone. M2 money supply, the broadest measure of dollars in circulation, jumped 25% in 2020. A single year, the largest single-year monetary expansion in American history. These are not political statements. They are published figures from official institutional sources. Three consecutive years above 1,000 tons, more than double the average of the prior decade. The institutions managing the global monetary system are not buying gold because they are confident in paper currency. Institutions that are confident in paper currency do not accumulate gold at the fastest rate in modern recorded history. They accumulate gold because they are hedging against a scenario they are preparing for internally while not discussing publicly. The German middle class trusted their institutions in 1914. They donated their gold for iron. They kept their savings in marks. They held their war bonds and their life insurance policies. A life insurance policy paid monthly for 20 years bought one loaf of bread in 1923. The institutions were not lying to them. The institutions were simply preparing for something different than what they were communicating. That pattern is not unique to Germany. It is not unique to 1923. It is the documented behavior of monetary institutions at every major inflection point in modern economic history. So what does the forensic record actually recommend for the serious businessman, the aspiring entrepreneur, the young professional building wealth in this precise macroeconomic moment? Not panic. The record does not reward panic. It punishes it as severely as it punishes complacency. What the record recommends breaks into four specific, documented, actionable frameworks, each drawn directly from the survival strategies of those who came through Weimar Germany with their financial positions intact. The first framework is positional clarity. Know precisely what each asset in your portfolio is designed to do. Gold is not a spending currency. It is a terminal store of value, a bridge asset held through crisis and converted strategically at stabilization. The businessman who understands this does not panic sell gold at the midpoint of a crisis. He has already arranged his parallel currency position to handle interim transactional needs. Gold sits separately, untouched, waiting for the other side. The second framework is parallel currency architecture. Before any visible crisis arrives, the serious businessman establishes positions in multiple currency systems, not because he knows which one will become the functional unit of account during a crisis, because he does not know, and neither does anyone else, but because optionality built before crisis is worth 10 times the optionality scrambled together during it. Not instead of it, alongside it. This is not paranoia. This is the documented cognitive practice of every Weimar-era businessman who maintained commercial viability through the collapse. When the official unit of account begins to wobble, the man who has already been thinking in commodity terms does not need to rebuild his mental framework under pressure. It is already built. The fourth framework is decision velocity. The Weimar record is unambiguous on this point. The speed at which a businessman processes new economic information and converts it into action is not a personality trait. It is a survival variable. Sebastian Hafner's father did not deliberate on payday. He converted. Immediately. Completely. Without waiting for confirmation that the decision was correct. The businessman who requires certainty before acting in a fast-moving monetary environment will always be acting on yesterday's prices with today's diminished currency. Hugo Stinnes, the man Time magazine called the new emperor of Germany in 1923, did not survive the Weimar hyperinflation. He dominated it. He borrowed enormous sums in Reichsmarks before the collapse. He converted those borrowed marks into coal mines, steel factories, shipping lines, hotels, and newspapers. He stored his profits as gold in Swiss bank vaults. When the crisis peaked, he repaid every debt in paper marks worth a fraction of what he had originally borrowed. He did not hand a gold coin to a baker. He used the collapsing system itself as the instrument of his wealth transfer. That is the single most documented wealth preservation and accumulation strategy from the worst hyperinflation in Western history. It required no luck. It required no inside information. It required one thing only, a complete structural understanding of how monetary collapse actually functions. built and implemented before the moment of crisis made thinking clearly impossible. The gold blunder everyone makes during hyperinflation is not buying gold. Buying gold is correct. The blunder is believing that buying gold is the end of the strategy, rather than the beginning of it. The question is whether you have read the actual autopsy, and whether you have built the framework it recommends before the moment arrives. That makes building it nearly impossible.